Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on sex, gender diverse First Nations. Since the 1970s, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and sex, gender diverse First Nations peoples across the world have attempted to undo some of the damage done by colonization, damage done to sex, gender diverse identities and social roles. Some cultures have retained original terms for sex, gender diverse identities and social roles. However, many have not retained them. Many sex, gender diverse First Nations people have therefore created new terms to replace those that have been lost. This aligns with what United States of American Joanne Hagel refers to as ethnic renewal. So here she defines ethnic renewal as individual ethnic renewal occurs when an individual acquires or asserts a new ethnic identity by reclaiming a discarded identity, replacing or amending an identity in an existing ethnic repertoire, or filling a personal ethnic void. So there is this acknowledgement within this process of ethnic renewal of bringing forward the fact that previous identities have been lost or taken away through process of colonization. So we see in many parts of the world, sex and diverse First Nations peoples are attempting to reclaim identities that have been lost, or when identities have been lost and irreplaceable, creating new ones in their place. The term Two-Spirit is a contemporary term used throughout Canada and the United States of America, and it is perhaps one of the most well-known examples of this ethnic renewal. It was coined in 1990 to acknowledge a sense of community among those for whom original terms for their nations, identities, and social roles have been lost due to processes of colonization. It doesn't replace terms that have survived, and as we'll see soon, many First Nations across North America have retained knowledge of their sex, gender diverse identities and social roles. But it can be used to refer to historical examples of sex, gender diverse First Nation peoples. But it is mostly limited to contemporary examples where original terms have been lost as a result of colonization. Curtis Harris Davia from the San Carlos Apache Nation explains, "We adopted Two-Spirit because it does encompass more traditions than any other terms that we've come across. And it is also a fairly accurate reflection in terms of how most of our communities see us. We started to use this term because we didn't feel comfortable in many cases in simply defining ourselves by the colonizer's culture. We said that you were now going to be either gay, lesbian, or bisexual." So this is really our first real look at why these new terms are emerging. Because First Nations peoples, and in particular sex, gender diverse First Nations peoples, have articulated quite clearly that Western concepts of sex, gender, and sexual orientation don't meet the needs of sex, gender diverse First Nations peoples. Terms like gay or transgender aren't the same as the lived experiences of Two-Spirit peoples. United States of America Will Roscoe famously quoted, "The ground America society occupies once may have been the queerest continent on the planet." And this is an important quote, and I use it quite often because it acknowledges that we think of terms such as, queerness as a very contemporary modern Western concept. But anthropology and history tells us that many cultures across the world have had a great deal of queerness, a great deal of sex, gender, and sexual orientation that is far more diverse than contemporary Western concepts. He notes that, Roscoe notes that the term two-spirit people have been documented in nearly 150 North American societies. So while some of those have retained their language, their identities, their terms, a lot of them have not. So that's why we are referring them here in that phrase, two-spirit people. But not all of those 150 North American societies have lost their identity. Some have retained them. But the fact that 150 of these societies have had documented some form of two-spirit people, it tells us that it was quite a common experience. Groundbreaking research conducted by Roscoe and others has revealed that sex gender diverse First Nations peoples in North America include individuals who may correspond to contemporary Western concepts of gay, lesbian, transgender, and people with intersex variations. However, those terms are merely being used by me to sort of give you an understanding, a bridge to cross, because mostly those terms would not be used. So it's been well documented that there are male-bodied individuals undertaking predominantly women's roles and identities. There have been female-bodied individuals undertaking predominantly male roles and identities. There's been male and female-bodied individuals undertaking both men's and women's roles and identities. Often, however, sex gender diverse First Nation peoples in North America took on roles and identities that have nothing to do with gendered work, but were spiritual in nature. And this is why terms such as gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual don't neatly fit into First Nations peoples and sex gender diverse First Nations peoples, because a great deal of two-spirit identities, lived experiences, roles were spiritual in nature, which isn't a part of contemporary terms such as gay, lesbian, transgender. So this is why contemporary terms such as two-spirit has garnered such attention and has been widely adopted, because it emphasizes that spiritual nature of roles and identities, as opposed to Western concepts that just emphasize sex, gender, and sexuality. Sometimes those called to undertake spiritual roles did so because of a dream, and not necessarily because they wanted to live as men or they wanted to live as women. So when we come to understand sex gender diverse First Nations peoples in North America, we have to really shift our Western thinking of seeing it as about sex, seeing it about gender or gender identity or sexual orientation, who one was sexually attracted to. For a lot of two-spirit people, that was not the case at all. It was a spiritual role that really drew them. Despite the use of the term two-spirit, many First Nations peoples in North America have retained knowledge of their identities and social roles. And I'm going to go through a few North American nations, First Nations, and give you an example of those terms that have been retained and have not been lost. I'm not going to do any justice to try and pronounce any of these terms because my my North American language skills are not very good. So I'll just address the English versions if that's okay. So here we can see the Cree Nation, and we can see there are at least 6 terms that refer to people who encompass a wide range of lived experiences. So men who dresses as women, woman dresses as man, dressed or lived or accepted as man, and one who actually lives as a woman. Excuse me. So there you can see there is very subtle differences between these lived experiences and terms that capture these subtle differences in the Cree Nation. In the Lakota, we have terms such as, again, I'm not going to try and pronounce them, but wants to be like a woman. And in the Navajo, we have one who is transformed to one who changes. So these are terms, and I'm showing images here of documented images of people who survived at least to the point of photography for us to include, to show some of those individuals who lived at that time. We also have the Crow Nation, the Biday, which is, and I'm here showing a photograph of Oshtish, who fought in the 1876 Battle of the Rosebud. And this really draws attention to how a lot of the social roles that were undertaken were quite well established in terms of adopting male and female roles. And I'm going to step back from that, not adopting, but blurring those roles. And men and women all, regardless of their gender, did that. Cisgender women and men, I meant to say. The Zuni Nation as well. And here we have a famous Zuni person, Wiha. And they were quite famous at the time because they became a prominent cultural ambassador, and they visited Washington, D.C., meeting President Cleveland. And their visit was quite well documented as well. And here are a couple of photographs of them around 1886. Now I'm going to move over to India. So the term Hijra refers to individuals who in the West we may refer to as transgender, eunuchs, or people with intersex variations. Again, I'm using these terms just as a bridge to help us understand some of the lived experiences of the Hijra. So, however, much like the Two-Spirit people in North America, these Western terms don't accurately account for the actual lived experiences and identities and social roles of the Hijra. Hijra are found throughout South Asia, in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. But terminology varies considerably. In India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan, they have all legally acknowledged the existence of a third gender. And I use the word quotes because that's how that's acknowledged in the law. However, the legal protection and recognition also varies across the region, and discrimination based on not conforming to gender binary does continue. So we can see that there is increasing social acceptance and legal acceptance, legal protection, but at the same time there are limitations in various countries. Also, not unlike the Two-Spirit people in North America, the social role of the Hijra is largely spiritual and deeply connected to religion. American cultural anthropologist Serena Nanda writes, the interchange of male and female qualities, transformations of sex and gender, and alternative sex and gender roles, both among deities and humans, are meaningful and positive themes in Hindu mythology, ritual, and art. So this idea of the interchangeable male and female qualities, interchange of gender identities, gender roles, isn't limited to human society, but is very deeply embedded within Hindu religion. Many of Hinduism's deities engage in so-called cross-gender activities. They live periods of their life in either gender and all in themselves are androgynous. The Hijra worship Bhakara Mata, one of the many versions of the mother goddess worshipped throughout India. So there is an established legitimacy in terms of the intersection of the sex, gender diversity and spirituality and religion. According to Indian anthropologist Garachi Reddy, the interrelationship in Hijra and Hinduism applies to all Hijra, including those Hijra who are Muslim. Hijras have the power to confer blessings on the birth of male children and fertility at weddings. So this is a very key element to understanding the social acceptance within the Hijra, because they have a very specific role in terms of using that spirituality, the meanings of spirituality, and they are brought in to bless the birth of a male child and the fertility at weddings. So they're incorporated into these very important life moments. So I'm going to just have one quick brief mention of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Trans and sex gender diverse First Nations peoples have been recorded throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And they also have reclaimed lost identities and cultures, as well as celebrated those that have survived colonizations. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them, but I just wanted to give you a quick synopsis of some of the ones that are just in our localized area. So we do have the Samoa Fa'afafine. I don't know why I try. So I'll just say Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, Tuvalu, New Zealand, and Indonesia. So we do have clear documentation of sex gender diverse First Nations peoples in these countries. But I do want to talk about Australia, in particular, the trans and sex gender diverse First Nations peoples, also known as sister girls and brother boys. So not unlike North America, many of the identities and social roles of trans and sex gender diverse First Nation peoples in Australia have been lost due to processes of colonisation. However, in the Northern Territory, some of these terms have survived, and it's really the only place in Australia where these terms have really survived. So we have key terms in the Tiwi Islands, Alice Springs area, Western Desert, and northwest of Alice Springs. Again, I'm not going to attempt to try with my Aboriginal language skills, they're not very good. This is an image of Crystal Love, who was a very famous sister girl based in the Tiwi Islands. And if you live in Darwin, you often will see Crystal Love performing around town. In my research on trans and sex gender diverse people living in the Northern Territory, and this is my area of expertise, I discuss how there is a community of sister girls and brother boys living in the Tiwi Islands, and they have a moderate degree of social acceptance. And sister girls and brother boys from across the Northern Territory often move there to escape the transphobia they face in their home communities, and also the racism they face in predominantly white transgender communities. So it's become a bit of a community of refuge for people who may be experiencing discrimination in their own lives elsewhere. In my book published in 2018, Trans Dilemmas, I write, even if sister girls and brother boys are accepted by their communities, they may also be forced to leave their family and country. Not unlike non-Indigenous people, trans Indigenous people are often torn between their gender and their ethnicity, forced to make a choice of either being trans or being Aboriginal. So one of the key elements of my research in my interviews with sister girls and brother boys across the Northern Territory is that there is this tension between these identities. And often there is a pull between which identity is going to be the one to predominate, certainly in terms of living in one's home country, one's home community, or living. Last slide. So across the world, sex gender diverse First Nations people are putting back together identities and social roles that were destroyed by colonization. Some are reclaiming terms and others are creating new terms, such as two-spirit and sister girls and brother boy. Many of these reclaimed and new identities and social roles are not aligned with Western terms which prioritize sex, gender, and sexuality. So when we do talk about sex, gender diverse people, First Nations people, we have to be wary of conflating them with contemporary Western concepts such as gay or transgender. In particular, that's because two-spirit people in Hijra occupy spiritual roles, and that element doesn't translate into Western concepts. A few key terms, key authors, and I've included myself in that, so feel free. Thanks, everyone.